Namaste. Welcome to my podcast. I want to start this podcast by wishing every listener of this podcast a very happy new year. May your year be full of outrage and virtue signaling. Now that I have made my mandatory sarcastic remark of the day, let's move on to serious business. I try to cover a wide range of topics on this podcast. My aim personally has always been to talk about subjects that I feel are not covered in the mainstream media and where people can actually tune in and get some nuanced views. India's foreign policy is one such sphere. It just happened to be that it never fructified in the last year. I actually genuinely wanted to do this podcast in the last year, but we just couldn't get through to it. When it comes to international relations, the image we get these days, आजकल जो हम देखते हैं, is just a bunch of loonies shouting on television from Pakistan, and then they get it back in equal quality and quantity from the Indian side. In all this shouting and screaming, no one really knows what is India's foreign policy. At least I don't know. And I'll be the first one to admit that. What has been the historical trend? Why do we take certain decisions when let's say, why did we take the decision to vote against Israel in the United Nations in the recent vote about Jerusalem, the American embassy moving to Jerusalem? So to discuss these issues, I'm actually excited that Abhijit Iyer agreed to come on my podcast. Welcome to the podcast, Abhijit.
Thank you, Kushal. It's always a pleasure to talk to you and happy to be here and Happy New Year, guys.
So, Abhijit, before we get into the nitty-gritty of Indian foreign policy, why don't you tell the listeners a bit about yourself and your background?
Okay, so mostly I work with defense policy, defense economics specifically, but a lot of it actually involves foreign policy as well, because you can't have a defense policy unless you understand your surroundings. So I work for a think tank called the Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies, and before that, I used to work for another think tank called the Observer Research Foundation, and before that, I spent about 7 years in Melbourne teaching at Monash University.
Okay, so Abhijit, this is how I wanted to structure this podcast. So to begin with, and I'll give you the reason why I'm saying this. So it's obviously an anecdote, but it's a very important anecdote. So I was at a coffee shop, and we were just having a normal political discussion. Indians like to discuss politics even if they don't know anything about it. Mm-hmm. So during the discussion, foreign policy came up, and I used the word non-alignment. And the expression on the other side was as if mujhe kutta kaat gaya.
Yeah.
So what? I mean, I was shocked that these are educated people and they did not know what non-alignment as if at a philosophical level is. They did not know a lot about Indian foreign policy per se. And then I used to think I knew a lot about Indian foreign policy, and I got a reality check. Actually, I don't even know a lot about Indian foreign policy. So now my first question to you would be that, can you give actually, a small history of what was the philosophy behind India's foreign policy? Like, what was our trajectory? How did we start? What was the rationale behind our first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru? And what were the socio-political compulsions behind this whole, we'll be non-aligned thing? Whether it is right or wrong, we can take it in the next step. But why did they do what, this particular action, or why did they think of coming up with this concept of non-alignment?
Okay, so there's two parts to this question. First, if you don't mind, I'm just going to address why a lot of people don't know about foreign policy. And mostly it's because a lot of the foreign policy commentariat uses this very, very highfalutin jargon terms, right? Non-alignment being one of them. And that's something I've worked quite hard to kind of dispel, because I don't like jargon too much, and I like more people to get involved in foreign policy, because right now it's become this sort of preserve of the elite kind of thing. And that is very deliberate, because if you look at the way Nehru saw foreign policy, he fancied himself as Ambassador Raskotra once put it to me, that in the morning, Nehru used to talk to the gods, and in the afternoon, he used to tell us what the signals from the foreign policy gods were. And that really was the problem with our foreign policy. It was so elitized that there was no real understanding of it outside of certain circles. And this is, of course, the problem with non-alignment as well. It started off with the best of intentions, right? Because at that point, immediately after World War II, you have the Cold War that sets in. By 1948, the Cold War is very, very clear. You have the USSR on one side with the Warsaw Pact and the communist bloc, and you have the USA on the other side with the capitalist bloc. And obviously, everyone wanted India in their camp because it's a huge demographic chunk. And we have a lot of documents, less from the Soviet side, at least less that we know of from the Soviet side, but a lot from the American side that showed that India was priority number one in South Asia, but that South Asia was actually a very, very low priority for America at that time. And the theory was that if you avoided joining any one of these camps, you could extract the most from both camps. So basically, think of it as a very, very beautiful girl playing off two guys to get the maximum benefits from them before she decides to marry them. Maybe one guy will offer her a BMW, the other guy will offer her a Mercedes. That's the general rationale. There was also a second rationale for it, and this is where things get slightly confusing. Remember, at that point, we had three kind of semi-neighbors surrounding neighbors and semi-neighbors. The USSR to our north, which was just about, if you look at uh, Kashmir, as in what India would like you to believe is the whole of Kashmir, we're only about 20-30 kilometers away from the Soviet Union, the northernmost part of India. On the east, we have China. On the west, we have Pakistan. Pakistan now it was a big issue, but the two biggest giants that we could not afford to antagonize were China and Russia at that point. And the thing was, how do you prevent such a huge political demographic force that was Russia and China together from breathing down your throat? And that's why initially, in the initial stages, non-alignment made a lot of sense. It was a lot more about keeping us away from the Russo-Chinese orbit as much as it was about anti-colonialism. That said, as it progressed, what happened was, and this is a big problem with not just Indian policy people, it's a problem with everybody, that, once you get too big for your shoes, you start taking yourself too seriously. And we started taking all our anti-colonial rhetoric very seriously. At which point it became more anti-America in a sense. And even though China was doing things to us even before the India-China war, were doing things to us that weren't exactly in our interests, we would keep pretending that these insults, these violations of our sovereignty had not happened. So it was a well-conceived policy, which, like all Indian policy, really, India is an enforcement deficit state. And that's what you see happens with this policy, a very well-conceived policy that's completely mucked up in its enforcement. Yeah.
So I had a question in regards to this. So the way you explained it, I see a lot of the elitism in Nehru's thinking is obviously there. But what I find fascinating is that basically, okay, I get it. When we start something, the partition was also something very traumatic. So considering the partition and the aftermath of the partition, any leader of India and its formation ke salome, obviously they would be very circumspect about taking a stand on anyone, because we're kind of geographically fucked too, in that sense. We're not like the United States of America, जिसका neighbor ही Canada है, जो
Absolutely.
anyway अमेरिका के ऊपर डिपेंडेंट है आधी चीजों के ऊपर. So I get that, but what about the elitism aspect of this? It is always as if, not only just Nehru, the entire establishment in India looks down upon the whole population of the country as a bunch of jahil gawar idiot, and I mean, इनको क्या पता क्या करना है. Okay, 10 साल 15 साल, but even today मतलब हमारे देश के लोग आज भी जाहिल गंवा रहे, because if I look at India's foreign policy even today, I don't understand what India's foreign policy is.
Right. So, two things to the question. First is, the screwed up geography we exist in. And the second is the elitism part. So remember, America actually achieved its position of having two very good neighbors through foreign policy. The War of 1812 was the last time when Canada was still a British colony that Canadian British troops basically came down, burnt down the White House, burnt down the Capitol building. And people tend to forget how poisonous that particular relationship was. So when US military bands today play the 1812 overture that Tchaikovsky wrote to celebrate the Russian victory in the Napoleonic Wars, America actually uses it to celebrate its victory in that particular the Anglo-US War, several of which followed US independence. Second thing, very surprisingly, Mexico for a long time was to America what Pakistan is to us. The last cross-border raids, because Mexico was the superpower. It wasn't America. Mexico was the American superpower in the 1700s and things like that. And what happens is Mexico couldn't reconcile itself to the loss of Texas and California and large parts of that during its wars with America. So the last cross-border raids, they actually used to do a lot of cross-border raids into Texas and places like that. And the last of those were well into the 20th century. I think 1905, 1906 is the last recorded Mexican raid into US territory. And there was a famous general called General Omar Bradley, who was the man tasked with stopping these things. So America was also in a stage of our development. I mean, if you want to put it very it's no analogy is exact, but Canada was to America what China is to India, and Mexico was to America what Pakistan is to India. So they got there because they had great clarity of vision. We still haven't gotten anywhere near there because we don't have that clarity of vision. And this brings us to the second aspect of elitism. First, remember Nehru. There are two kinds of elitism. One is elitism where you cultivate elitism as a sort of socially aspirational thing. You create an elite so that people aspire to it, want to go there, want to better themselves. Then there is elitism that basically masks incompetence. And invariably, that's what happened with Indian foreign policy. You had somebody like Nehru who believed he knew better than everybody else. Fair point. Probably he did. Except when your policies start failing, where everything around you, be it your enforcement, your discipline, starts crumbling around you, you double down. You say, you people don't understand foreign policy. I know what I'm doing. You stay out of it. And with the benefit of hindsight, what we know is Ambedkar and Sardar Patel clearly understood foreign policy a lot better than Nehru did. But this is all with the benefit of hindsight. The problem with Nehru is he could see setbacks in his policy happening on a daily basis. He could see things like blatant indiscipline. For example, the vote cast in favor of the Soviet Union when it invaded Hungary, when in fact Nehru had very clearly instructed otherwise. And yet the representative, Krishna Menon, went and voted for the Soviet Union. And there were no consequences to it. I can give you a lot of examples like this where the enforcement of this policy just broke down completely into venomous anti-Americanism in a way we would never criticize the Soviet Union or China. And in spite of all of this, the one aspect that's so clear about Nehru is that he can't absorb a lesson when it is given to him. He is absolutely convinced he knows everything repeatedly. And that really forced him to double down on the elitism. It didn't make him a humble man. If anything, he actually becomes till the 1962 war, which really broke him. You actually see that he monopolizes foreign policy in a way that was very unhealthy for any democratic setup.
Now I have to move. Obviously, no discussion on foreign policy can go without Pakistan. But my question on Pakistan is slightly different. I've always felt that our foreign policy is too Pakistan obsessed. I mean, do you think we should be Pakistan obsessed, or do you think we should be China obsessed?
So this is where reality catches up with aspiration. We would like to be China obsessed. The reality is that we're not Pakistan obsessed out of a desire to be Pakistan obsessed. It's more that Pakistan is a tactical problem. It makes itself a tactical problem. And that is where the Pakistan China collusion angle comes in. China did not want to be hyphenated with India. We've certainly given them a lot of leeway in that because economically we're nowhere near China. So that hyphenation ended long back. The problem is China also has a very, very clear goal on how to keep us hyphenated with Pakistan all the time. And sometimes we also fall into that trap. I don't know if it's a trap though, because like all humanities, there's no right answer to this. On one hand, what do we do? Do we keep ignoring Pakistani provocations, which then just keep going higher and higher and higher tempo till we ultimately say, focus on Pakistan, sanction Pakistan, do this to Pakistan or else, and then we automatically get hyphenated with Pakistan. And honestly, I don't have a solution to this problem because if Pakistan is determined to make itself our primary problem, you have no option but to deal with that problem. And till Pakistan's India obsession continues, India's reciprocal Pakistan obsession will have to continue. It's not even a question of should we focus on China. The issue really here is taking your eye off Pakistan will be very, very dangerous for us.
No, I get we should not take our eyes off Pakistan, but again, very bad analogy, but I'm going to use it anyways. Let's say you're living in a housing complex, right? There are 10 people in this house. So you live with 10 other families, and there's this one constant pain in the ass. Now, you're not going to ignore the pain in the ass. So what do you do with that pain in the ass? You set up the basic infrastructure that is needed to deal with the pain in the ass. So I think India has that. I mean, if we wanted to obliterate Pakistan, we can do that in a blink of an eye. I mean, literally, we can do that. Now,
Right.
beyond that, what else can Pakistan do? I mean, other than short-term irritations, like Pakistan is like that nagging neighbor, who would always come and ask, "Ye de dena, wo de dena," and you basically have to deal with that. But if we are obsessed with that, my biggest worry, and again, it comes to direction. Like, I don't know what India's stand on China is. There is a huge ass country that is basically trying to interfere in all countries where we have had historically good relations with. Let's say Nepal, or we say Sri Lanka, or we say Bhutan. These are all countries. India's always had very good relations with these countries, all these small countries. But China is pretty much bullying its way into every single country there. Now we are constantly obsessed with Pakistan. We keep on saying, I mean, at the end of the day, why doesn't the Indian establishment pretty much tell Pakistan off? Yeah, so you have a nuclear bomb. We have much more than you got. So what's stopping us from doing that?
Okay, so I'm going to stretch your analogy a bit because it's actually a very good analogy. I'm just going to change the terms around a bit. Think of Pakistan as a hemorrhoid and China as a brain tumor. A hemorrhoid won't really kill you. You can keep using hemorrhoid ointment to get rid of it, but nobody actually knows what exactly causes hemorrhoids. So you're never actually going to get rid of it. As opposed to a brain tumor, which will actually kill you. But here's the point. If you've got a brain tumor very deep in your brain, removing it will probably mean severe brain damage to you yourself. And that really is our problem. Now, the thing is, with nuclear weapons, it doesn't really come down to a question of numbers. If they take out just Bombay and Delhi and Bangalore, 3 cities, that's such a huge part of your intellectual capital just wiped out. That's your 3 most economically productive centers. It's the concentration of all your intellectual capabilities, industrial capabilities, knowledge of capitals and markets and all of that just wiped out. So that's the problem with nuclear weapons. It numbers count at some mad level, but even one or two nuclear weapons is one or two weapons too many. You do not challenge a nuclear weapons power like that. Which again comes back to the hemorrhoid analogy, which is why you can keep putting piles ointment on them, but you can never really get rid of them completely. And China, the problem is it's too big. Ultimately, this is a case of the rabbit who keeps getting crushed by the elephant, or at least his house keeps getting destroyed by the elephant. But what can realistically a rabbit do to China? Ultimately, the answer lies within ourselves. And this is the core of foreign policy, that there is no such thing as foreign policy. It's really a whole bunch of domestic policies that has international consequences. And when your economy is so weak compared to the Chinese economy, is so small compared to the Chinese economy, there are certain your industrial capacity, your intellectual capacity, your social problems, they're all, we don't stand up to comparison with China. So it's also a question of हमको खुद अपनी औकात जाननी चाहिए. China is not so easy to deal with one on one. You have to do it with alliances. And this is where our traditional, this is, the baggage of non-alignment comes in. That for us, non-alignment became one where you don't choose sides to one where it was just blatant anti-Americanism, which is why we can't even create alliances properly against China in that sense. The third issue here is that our China policy, nobody really knows, including the MEA or the Prime Minister knows what China policy is. In fact, I would argue that mostly in India, we don't know what our policies are at all. And there's a reason for it. You can even see this in the way it's carried out. The military, for example, will always be very muscular and upfront in the way it deals with China. Military people, military think tanks, they'll always come say, China, 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 China is a big threat. We need money to deal with China. We need it now. Diplomacy, on the other hand, you will always see diplomats trying to, Indian diplomats especially, a lot of them, not all, a lot of them very frequently, and it's very personality driven, will always try to downplay things with China. And the third issue, which is the biggest issue, is the lack of knowledge we have about China in this country. We have only about 100 trained Mandarin speakers, right? And in India, we don't fund primary scholarship. So everything that Indians learn about China is through books. Very few of them actually travel around China, spend 2-3 break years in China, as opposed to American or French or German students who just go to China, spend 2-3 years there, work for a company, do internships, they have research funds from universities and things like that, and they get that basic knowledge of China. We don't do that. Our diplomats who train about China have a very academic knowledge of it, or a stunted knowledge of it, because their knowledge is gained from their postings out there. And if you're a diplomat posted there, your knowledge of a country is very different from when you've been a businessman out there or a student roaming and living out there. So it's across the board. There's a certain policy schizophrenia with it between the military and your bureaucracy. And there's a lack of knowledge problem out there. Plus, there's also a lack of direction problem, because there's lots of these very high-sounding esoteric principles that we're very good at, but when it comes to the nitty-gritty and the exact contours of policy, we never actually have a clear focus set.
Yeah, you've raised a very vital point about I call it the mediocrity of Indian discourse. Uh, where
Exactly.
you've just mentioned how we hardly have any experts, and this was my experience too when I used to live in the West. I used to find their methodology and the way they would approach any country or any culture very fascinating. As if they had if they would want to study India, I mean, the amount of questions they would ask me, even a general person in the West, they would ask me, okay, so which part of India are you from? Okay, what are the cultural nuances in that part of your country? Why? Okay, what language do you speak? Okay, why do you do this? Why do you do that? I mean, in my experience, the Indian way of dealing with is, हाँ भाई मेरे को 3 साल उधर रहना है, उधर इंडियन रेस्टोरेंट किधर है पहले ये पता लगाओ, तो मेरी दाल रोटी का तो काम हो गया. And this mediocrity basically seeps into everything. Now the second question I wanted to link it with is, now usually when it comes to foreign policy, and even in a lot of psych studies, they say trade usually makes relations better. because the more trade you have, the more interaction you have on the other side. Even if there is any animosity, it reduces a lot. I mean, honestly, do you think, I mean, India and China do a lot of trade, but has that trade really helped India in any way in terms of foreign policy?
Okay, so first regarding that curiosity point, uh, a lot of the curiosity in India, the lack of curiosity rather, comes from this belief that if you get a degree from a university, you somehow know it all, that a degree equals knowledge and there's nothing left to learn. And you remember we were talking about Nehru and how he used to use his elitism to kind of cover up his foreign
Yeah.
policy flaws and a refusal to introspect. That's that same mentality of that you see, and this is why I don't think it was a problem unique to Nehru. I think it's an Indian problem, which somehow it's a human problem, which somehow is much more salient in India than it is in the West, primarily because of the way they've taken their very professional focus on inquiry and things like that. Second issue here is trade. Well, trade doesn't necessarily make relations better. Uh, ancient Rome and ancient Gaul were the two biggest trade partners in Europe in pre zero in BC Europe. And Gaul invaded Rome regularly till Julius Caesar finally invaded and settled Gaul. You want to take that to the modern age. India's trade with Europe was massive. And yet, Europe found the reason to come and colonize India precisely because of that trade. Similarly, Japan's international trade was great, and then when the Americans impose a oil embargo on it, Japan starts off the Second World War in the Pacific by going and invading and annexing a lot of the regions that used to trade that it depended on for raw materials intensely. Now, thankfully, modern trade has changed a lot. I don't think it improves relations that much as it prevents war. And to this, we need to go to this book that was written in 1905, 1906, I think, by Norman Angell. It was called The Great Illusion. And, he argued that because Germany and Britain were so interconnected with trade, Germany, Britain, and France were so interconnected with trade, the world simply wouldn't go to war. And, well, we know what happened just 10 years later when World War I started up. So, it always seems that some of these assumptions are true till something breaks in the system and the system collapses. So I would be very, very careful. I would say trade generally tends to make relations better, but it does not better. Trade generally tends to make war difficult, but it certainly doesn't make war impossible.
Also, don't you think, what is the balance when it comes to the trade? Like when you look at India and China trade, there is such a huge asymmetry in terms of how much deficit we have in comparison to China. So, I mean, in some scenarios, you could think, you could bully China.
Actually, we can't bully China at all because the nature of India China trade is exactly the nature of pre independence British India trade. We used to supply Britain with raw materials. That is what we do to China. If you look at exports to China, it's all commodities. If you look at our imports from Britain, as with China, it was all finished goods, right? With China, especially, it's this huge thing of mobile phones because you've got the Indian market is an extremely price sensitive market because the low uh, propensity, it's a low propensity to consume market. So the price sensitivity is very, very high. And what happens here is a lot of the new economy that we've developed, Ola, Uber, Zomato, and things like that, are all based on apps and mobile phones. 90% of which, probably for us at least, come from China. So they have a disproportionate hold on our economy, whereas what we supply to China, India doesn't have any minerals that are absolutely unique to it. So if we decide to stop supplying China tomorrow, China can always find alternative sources of supply. It may be slightly more expensive, but the alternates exist. On the other hand, if India decides to suspend all mobile phone purchases from China, just think of what's going to happen to our economy. You don't have any other country that really produces mobile phones that way. And second, even if it did, those economies of scale don't exist in any other country. So you certainly won't be getting them that cheaply. And this, of course, happens with the entire spectrum of Indian imports from China, because they cheap electronics, they cheap lots of things. It's that unique market that for India to move from a low income group to a middle income group, we are uniquely dependent on Chinese products that are aimed towards that low to middle income group market. Whereas if you look at American or German goods, they're extremely high value addition that are aimed at high value addition markets.
Now that's a very vital point. Obviously, some crazy kook on the Hindu side will say, "Oh, we can make anything if we put our heads to it." Yeah,
So not
obviously.
happening, not in my lifetime.
Yeah, they'll be like, "We'll use telepathy." You don't know our ancestors knew telepathy also.
Oh God, this is like that. We knew the Pushpaka Vimana and we invented flying.
Yeah, so that's the thing. Now I'm going to ask you, probably, I don't know, this is more of a personal query. I've always given this concept a thought, that every civilizational bent, I mean, I'm talking at a global level,
Mhm.
every set of human beings needs a policeman. There is going to be a policeman whether we like it or not,
Absolutely. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So I mean, if you ask me today, the world's policeman is America, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So now this person, I always, do this thought experiment in my head, that what if America was not the policeman of the world? And I'm very honest here. I don't think so. India will ever be a policeman, at least not in the next 100 years. This is
I
my
agree.
view. So
100%. Yeah.
okay, so now what the fuck are we left with? We are left with China and Russia. Now, if you
Mhm.
ask me personally, I really don't want them to police the world. I mean, this is my view. But I wanted your views on this. And do you think this is even a valid thought that I've had in my head?
So I support you completely in with but just disagree with you with regards to one thing, which is I wouldn't even want India in its current state to be the world policeman, right? Because we have a whole bunch of problems all of our own. That said, I think America is the best policeman the world has ever had, and I'm very happy to say that very openly, even though it apparently has a huge negative connotation in India that you become a CIA agent or America ka paltu kutta or whatever nonsense. Now let's look at America. What's America done? It's moved from the British mercantilist model to a full-on capitalist model, which is generally a very good thing. It's not the best. It's certainly not optimized, but it's the best under the circumstances. What would a Chinese ruled world look like? And I shudder to think about that. First, I don't think it's going to happen. I'll come to that part later. But basically, China's thing is it's either my way or the highway, which is also Russia's example. So if you look at Russian satellite states in the past, the Warsaw Pact, they really didn't have a lot of freedom. They were pretty much slave states in that sense. Fine, they had certain internal freedoms, but externally there was virtually nothing they could do. China is different. China doesn't believe in allies, but it certainly has a very negative relationship with its biggest allies. You look at China's three closest allies. I mean, the Chinese don't do allies, but if you look at China's three closest allies in that sense, it's North Korea, Pakistan, and Burma, which tells you all you need to know about how China sees self validation in its friends, right? All three of them are to some extent dependent on China. Burma is the only one that was very, very smart, that knows how to play China like probably no other country on earth does. Burma can tilt from being completely anti China to completely pro China back to being anti China. And the Chinese keep falling for Burma and keep going back in there. So the Burmese have learned how to manipulate China in a way nobody else has. North Korea is slightly different. People say that China doesn't have pull on North Korea. Wrong again. China has a lot of pull on North Korea. It's just that North Korea sometimes doesn't stick to the Chinese timeline for certain things, nuclear tests, missile tests, and things like that. The Chinese actually do want a North Korean nuclear arsenal. They do want a North Korean missile arsenal. They just didn't want it at this point. They wanted the wait to be about 12 to 15 years longer till China's new weapons were ready to sort of deal with America. And then they'd say, now North Korea, go for it. So the only thing North Korea did wrong was to break the Chinese schedule. Pakistan, I'm not even going to go into. We all know how that game plays out. So between Russia, you look at Russia's closest friends. Is this a country you really want governing the world when it treats everybody around it like, you know, uh, not really our equals? China, again. Now, is America imperious? Yes. Is America arrogant and rude at times? Absolutely. But I'll tell you what, it's a lot better than what China and Russia will ever be. So, all up, much better America than China or Russia, and India, forget about it. Not happening in my life, like you said, not happening in 100 years.
So now that we are on America, can you explain what is India's foreign policy when it comes to the United States of America? Do we even have a conscious outlook on how to deal with America?
So here's the thing, if I knew the answer to that, I wouldn't even be in this podcast. I'd probably be driving several Rolls Royce and Mercedeses and have my own A380 business jet, right? So welcome. You asked one of the most important existential questions of foreign policy in the 20th and 21st century. America policy, there is no such, India doesn't do policy, right? We pretend we have policies. Uh, Let me approach this from a slightly different point of view. Our policy towards America is so inconsistent. On one hand, we say we want to have closer relations, yet you have ministers, military, and bureaucracy that keep saying, well, we can't really trust America. Now, how many statements do you want from your prime minister saying that America is a friend and we want closer relations with it for everybody else to fall in line with this? So clearly, there's a disconnect happening, right? And a lot of this has to do with our education. When you have the humanities, which are anyway taught from a left wing point of view, and that too when most of your intake is from a place like, say, JNU or Jadavpur, which are notoriously left wing, your your base, that is your foundations itself, are very left wing and anti America. Right. So you're always going to have this institutional resistance towards anything getting closer to America in one form or another. It really doesn't matter. If you look at a lot of our foreign policy experts today, at one point when they were in JNU, they were members of SFI, Students Federation of India, which is the CPIM linked student body.
Yeah.
And so this is one aspect of it, which is in addition to what we spoke before, which is a lack of proper education in India, right? There's no primary foreign policy research done. The third issue is you have a whole generation of leaders that doesn't really, I wouldn't say understand foreign policy, but they basically have a macrocognitive deficiency. They can't take a bird's eye view of things. They probably like to micromanage a lot and they get bogged down in the micro detail and they can't see the bigger picture. Sometimes the reverse happens, where you have somebody like Modi who gets the bigger picture that we need uh, closer ties with America for everything pretty much, but he's not able to enforce it because he isn't able to control his own bureaucracy. And this becomes a problem because, again, this comes down to what Nehru did. Nehru had a macro view just like Modi. Nehru was not able to tame and control. He was actually able to control the bureaucracy much better than Modi can. Now, the problem in both cases becomes your enforcement deficit. In both cases, they're basically compensating, they're playing a compensation game. And that, for me, I've reached this conclusion that India's foreign policy is all about compensating for across the board policy failure in everything, be it in agriculture, be it in building a green economy, in industrialization, in manufacturing, in everything, right? You set goals, you're not able to meet those goals, you don't want to introspect, and so your foreign policy then becomes very petulant, accusing other people of things, right? DRDO, for example, it was set up to make us technology independent. Yet, about 2, 3 years back, you had the minister saying, why isn't the DRDO become technology independent? Well, because the West is denying us technology. What the hell did you set up DRDO for? Uh, this whole, if you look at India's foreign policy, probably the one thing that explains it consistently across the board, whether it's friendship, whether it's petulance, whether it is disinterest, it is basically from a lack of capacity in terms of education, and it's a lack of enforcement. When you know you can't deliver, you can't really commit. It's like getting into a marriage and saying, I will only be true to you, knowing fully well you're a philandering bastard and you intend to sleep around.
Now, what bothers me in this entire process is that if we have so much lack of clarity, like how you have in America, you have proper right wing think tanks, you have left wing think tanks. In India, we have stink tanks. I feel at times, they
Yes,
just.
unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, everybody is a bunch of confused morons. It's like मेरे को कहाँ पे अच्छी शैंपेन मिलने वाली है, मैं वहाँ चले जाता हूँ भाई, लेके आ जाओ और अपना काम कर लो. It's like that. But in such a scenario, obviously, America being the leading country in the world, even they're not going to take you seriously. And I'm glad they do take us seriously. And a lot of credit has to go, I don't know to whom, but I just think in general, our economy has become big and everybody has to take us seriously now. This is my view now, that, India has basically become, kind of non-ignorable by sheer matter of its size and the growth that we are having. I mean, it could be faster, but that's the issue. But now I want to end the podcast with the most sensitive issue, which I believe, at least for people on Twitter who are aligned to the BJP or who hate the BJP, the one country, which is Israel.
Hmm.
Now, if there was one country that has, kind of stood with us in multiple ways, is Israel. If there was one country whose model we could actually emulate in multiple ways in our own society, is Israel. I
Yep.
mean, talk about being geographically fucked. I think Israel is, if not more, as fucked as we are.
Absolutely. Yeah.
In spite of that, this government, the so called right wing government too, votes against Israel. Now, what is this logic? And every time I listen to this answer, no, no, what about oil? We are dependent on, the Gulf nations for oil.
Mhm.
So, how much weightage does this argument have? And I know you had written an article about it recently where you had given the 5 standard points, if I remember correctly. But can you explain it to the listeners in detail over here again?
Sure. So here's the thing. Let's assume it was oil dependent. In that article, I'd mentioned a lot of things, that it was based on the fact that Israel doesn't mind us. They're used to us voting against them. America won't mind it because they're also used to us voting against them. Oil is the one thing which, if you notice, it's the reason I'm going to dwell on oil in this answer is because it's got a very curious psychology. On one hand, when the Congress is in power, all the BJP supporters will argue, look, Nehru never made us an energy sufficient country. He never turned to green energy. He never turned to this. He never turned to that. The Congress didn't build nuclear reactors during its rule and make us oil independent. Now, what's actually prevented you from getting away from oil dependency? Right? Nothing. And now these same people, once the Modi government, once a BJP government votes like this, will then say, oh, oil. We have to depend on oil and let's blame it on the Congress because they never built nuclear reactors. Now tell me, how many nuclear reactors has this government built? How many is it contracted? If anything, it's preventing any kind of progress on a green economy. You've seen Suzlon. Suzlon nearly collapsed last year or something like that because these guys simply aren't serious about going green at all on anything. And this is a consistent pattern of goalpost shifting that happens, right? Basically, it doesn't matter Congress or BJP. The only thing that explains it is that enforcement deficit. You keep inventing these new goalposts for one reason or another, uh, to basically justify anything. Now, who benefits from this? It's your foreign policy establishment, really, right? Because they have this set of beliefs that if you do not vote for if you vote for Israel, the Arab countries will get upset with you. They will kick out your diaspora one, and they will stop giving you oil too. Complete nonsense. The conundrum that I explained before with regards to India and China, that is also the same relationship we have with the Gulf. The Gulf exports commodities to us. We export certain indispensable services to them. You try kicking out 9 million uh, uh, semi-skilled to very skilled workers from the Gulf, you think any country is going to be able to fill that gap instantaneously? Impossible. It'll lead to a serious, serious systemic collapse for at least a period of 3 to 4, maybe more years till that gap is filled. So don't buy that argument for even a minute. Second is this whole oil bogey. And the oil bogey was very, very clear. Pax America, and this is why I like Pax America so much, guarantees that everybody that more or less follows the rules will benefit from the American peace, which is in this case guarantee of unlimited supply, well, free, relatively free supplies of oil. Right. So in 73, when they imposed the oil embargo, the Arab states imposed the oil embargo after the Yom Kippur War. Uh, Kissinger is on record that he went and threatened the Saudis and everybody else that you will break the embargo, you will break it now, because if you don't, then your worth to us is absolutely zero, and we will take necessary action. And this is precisely the kind of threats that the Saudis gave to. And notice, they will use oil pricing as a weapon every now and then, but it is such a blunt instrument. You can't say India will be charged oil at this price. If prices go up or go down, it benefits everybody or it affects everybody else. So I don't see how you can actually use this as a uh, uh, oil as an argument. It basically comes from this extraordinarily third rate kind of analysis, this third rate commentariat that we've built up, that neither understands the micro detail of economics, of energy politics, and especially not of defense. In many times I find even defense people understand nothing about defense economics. They live in 70s, and 70s warfare in India equals 1920s warfare in Europe. So it's a very low base that you're starting on, a very low base of knowledge, and an even lower base of third rate analysis that we base most of our things on. So I just generally just inure myself to this kind of commentary and just write what I need to and just ignore things that I hear in India.
But then let's talk about this government. I really don't have a very high opinion about Congress, anyways, and I always make it clear that I vote for the BJP, and I have my reasons. Now, nobody has to agree with those reasons, but um, when it comes to this government, do you think they have done anything sensible in terms of foreign policy till now? And what are the biggest blunders? Obviously, we know one blunder is voting against Israel consistently. But what do you think are the major blunders in the this current government's tenure? And is there anything that you think that they have done which is sensible and nice?
Right. So the two biggest blunders, one would be, and both basically born of listening to bad advice. The first one would be the NSG decision, right? Going in unprepared for NSG membership, which yielded absolutely no benefits to us. And you could clearly see, it was such bad groundwork, such bad speech work, such bad research that were done going into that whole issue out there. That was number one. Number two was this whole Israel vote. Like I wrote in that article, which was basically based on all kinds of false, untested assumptions that had never been tested since 1960 or 1970. In 1960 or 70, oil embargoes could be done, no more. So those would have been the two biggest disasters. What other people count as a disaster is neighborhood policy, which I actually don't. And for this, I'm going to quote the Mexican president Benito Juarez. He used to say that Mexico's great problem is that it's so far from God and so close to America. And that, is the problem with all neighborhood policy. If you kiss them on the cheek today, they will say, he, thank you so much. You kiss them on the cheek tomorrow, they'll say, oh my God, this is sexual harassment. This is, I'm trivializing it, but that kind of captures how neighborhood policy is. When you've got such a big giant in the room called India, and you have tiny neighbors that really can't influence the region, this kind of power differential is not a very healthy thing, right? So I think the government's done as good a handling of its neighborhood policy as could have possibly been done given all the limitations, given the capacity limitations, non-performance of your economy and things like that. The biggest success, undeniably, was Doklam. In fact, I still am amazed at how beautifully that entire thing was handled from A to Z. I honestly think somebody came from Venus or Mars or something like that, took control of our government for the period of, or at least the China department of our government for that entire period, and dealt with the Doklam policy, because it was so finessed. The very first day, the PMO issued instructions to everybody in the BJP, the MEA, the MOD, that you people are not going to talk. If you talk, we will sack you. And then it dealt with it in a way that was nothing short of inspired. So, and one of the reasons I'm still so much in awe of that Doklam thing is it is so uncharacteristic. How can you have a government that is so completely inept at dealing with the NSG and Israel on one hand? And Israel wasn't even such a big muck up. It was a muck up, a big muck up, but not stratospheric like the NSG muck up was. How can a government like that then pull off something so flawlessly and so perfectly like China? So I know for me that just raises a lot more questions than it gives me answers. But yeah, that would be my answer to the biggest success, the biggest failures, and the biggest misrepresented failures, in my opinion.
All right, so we've almost touched the 1 hour mark, and so I'm actually kind of happy we've covered quite a few areas of foreign policy. I mean, at least at the general level. So this message is for the listeners. See, this was my first podcast on foreign policy, so I actually wanted to make it a little general. Obviously, I'm going to do far more specific foreign policy podcasts in the future, where we actually delve deeply into a subject which is literally pertaining to one aspect or one historical event or say one country and the relationship involved in that. Now, if you guys have any specific questions for Abhijit, what I'll recommend is once you listen to the podcast, right? Abhijit's Twitter handle is going to be on the description of the podcast. I want you to ask him those questions. Maybe you guys have some things in mind, and you should engage with Abhijit on Twitter. He's very interesting on Twitter. His Twitter avatar is very unique.
Well,
Also,
it's
while
not
you're
bad.
no, it's amazing. I mean, Abhijit recently baptized me into Christianity. So here was an atheist, Abhijit, converting another atheist, Kushal, into Christianity. And Jesus was like, what the fuck? So it was kind
Praise
of
the Lord.
interesting.
Praise the Lord.
So I would urge everyone who listens to this podcast, take this seriously, because I think foreign policy is something we should all be very serious about.
Mhm.
And on that note, Abhijit, I'm really thankful to you, man. You've done a fantastic job of clearing a lot of doubts I had in my head. And when I told you about this podcast, I told you I'm a dummy when it comes to foreign policy too. So thanks a lot for doing this.
Hey, man, always thanks. It's always great chatting up with you. And like we discussed, sometime you have to clear all my dummy thoughts about Cārvāka.
Oh, yeah, we'll do that one day. But that's over a lot of good food.
And a lot of booze.
Oh, yeah. So
Yeah.
take care, buddy.
Thanks, man. Take care.
Bye.
Ciao.
Bye.